Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. And in this podcast episode, I think it's going to be a double episode. I'm going to be talking about emotional labor. And I'm going to say up front that as I've been working on this podcast episode, I've probably been working on it for 2 months or so. And one of the things I was realizing, maybe has taken me or that has added to the length of time that I've been working on it is I don't want to come across as this angry feminist. I don't see myself that way. Sure, there are things that sometimes happen that offend my feminist sensibilities and can make me angry. Sure. But that's not usually how I come across to people in general. That's usually something, my spouse may hear about it, my kids might hear about it, my sister might hear about it, friends may hear about it, but I don't usually, project that out onto other people. So I decided to go ahead and record this podcast episode. And I'm just going to say, I'm not angsty. I'm not angry. I think there is value in putting this out into the world and helping everybody understand and see what actually is required and the toll that it can take involved in emotional labor. So let's start off with a couple of definitions, because that's always good to kind of define so that we can be on the same page in our thinking about certain terms. So what is emotional labor? Emotional labor refers to the process of managing and regulating one's own emotions, as well as expressing those emotions to meet the expectations of a job or a social situation. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild first introduced the term emotional labor in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart: Commercialization of Human Feeling. Emotional labor involves displaying certain emotions deemed appropriate for a given role or context, even if they don't align with one's true feelings. So emotional labor is a concept commonly associated with service-oriented professions, such as customer service, healthcare, hospitality, and it carries significant societal implications. So service-oriented professions necessitate the display of positive emotions like friendliness, empathy, patience, even when they might not align with the person's own true feelings. The societal expectation of emotional labor extends beyond professional settings, though. It shows up in professional settings, and I'm going to talk about that. But it also extends beyond professional settings and seeps into family dynamics, friendships, romantic relationships. The psychological toll of this type of labor is substantial, as it demands the suppression or alteration of genuine emotions over extended periods of time. So that's emotional labor. Now let's talk about mental labor. So mental labor is a term that underscores the cognitive effort and thought processes involved in planning, organizing, decision-making, and managing tasks. Unlike physical labor, which involves bodily work, mental labor is characterized by activities that demand concentration, problem solving, analysis, awareness, and other intellectual tasks. Mental labor is a broad concept that encompasses a wide range of activities, many of which we engage in on a daily basis, from planning and scheduling to decision-making and problem solving. Mental labor is part of our lives in more ways than we might realize. So let's look at some of the ways that it shows up in our day-to-day life. So I talked about planning and scheduling, or I mentioned planning and scheduling. This includes organizing daily routines, making schedules, maybe putting together a carpool, completing tasks on time, getting kids ready to go back to school. We're at that time of year where, some mental labor and emotional labor is involved in getting kids ready to go back to school, balancing schoolwork and kids' extracurricular activities. All of that would include mental labor. A second area where we see mental labor on a day-to-day basis is in decision making. So this involves evaluating options, weighing pros and cons, and making informed decisions. Whether it's a financial purchase, a decision at work, or a parenting choice. Decision making is a significant mental task that can be mentally taxing. Another way it shows up day to day is problem solving, identifying issues, developing solutions, implementing strategies to address these challenges. As a parent, it may also include working with two of your kids, to problem solve and to manage the conflict that they might get into. And then another way it shows up is emotional and cognitive load management. So this means managing one's emotions and thoughts, as well as the emotions and thoughts of others. So we see this particularly in caregiving roles or customer service, parenting, and even with our primary relationships. So one of the things that I think when we talk about customer service, I'm sure we've all talked to a customer service person, employee, worker, who we have become frustrated with. And yet they're probably trying to do the best job that they can. Again, they're maybe dealing with a difficult circumstance and a script that they're supposed to go through. And maybe they're tasked with solving the problem instead of just passing it further up the chain. And they might be giving us answers that we don't like. I think it's also evident, in service-oriented professions like waitress, waiter, that type of stuff, where the way that they come across emotionally, which I'm sure can be, I worked in college as a waitress, and I wasn't always happy, but me presenting a happy, patient, easygoing, friendly demeanor was linked to the pay that I got. And I think we should be beyond that. I think, employers should pay them a living wage, and we should get rid of the tip culture that gives sometimes very difficult people a say over how much this person who's doing a difficult job gets paid. And then the last area that mental work shows up, or mental labor shows up on a day-to-day basis, is knowledge work. So these are activities that involve creating, processing, managing information, such as research, writing, data analysis, and other intellectual tasks. So mental labor is also related to other terms that you might hear it used with is cognitive labor or mental load, especially in discussions about domestic responsibilities. It shows up more as cognitive labor or mental load when we're talking about what happens at the home. Managing household tasks often require significant mental effort in addition to physical tasks, which again, often goes unnoticed and unrecognized. I think the fact that, for women who are not employed outside of the home, I know we have women who are working in work from home jobs, but, that's still different. Even if they're working within the home, having a job outside of the home, I think it's ridiculous that we're still referring to stay-at-home moms like they're just staying at home and they're not involved in day-to-day emotional labor, cognitive labor, and much of the work that they provide that we as a society benefit from goes unnoticed and unrecognized. So the mental load is often unequally distributed, with one person, which is frequently women in traditional patriarchal gender roles, shouldering most of this responsibility. This can lead to stress, burnout, feeling overwhelmed, especially when it's combined with other physical or emotional responsibilities. The concept of mental load highlights the importance of recognizing and fairly distributing these often unseen aspects of work in both personal and professional settings. We know that invisible labor is the work that greases the wheels of society, yet it often goes unacknowledged and unrewarded. Women frequently bear the brunt of this unseen work, from managing household tasks to tending to the emotional needs of others, revealing a deep-rooted gender inequality that demands our attention and it demands change. So in this episode, I do want to highlight women's often overlooked contributions to cognitive and emotional labor, as well as underscoring the importance of recognizing and addressing these inequalities. Women across the world are taught from a very young age to regulate, modulate, and manipulate their feelings to have a positive effect on the feelings of others. Women aren't just told to smile, but they're also tasked with making others smile. They're held accountable not only for expressing their feelings, but also for the feelings of others. This often happens in families where women are expected to put their energy, effort, and time towards catering to the building of a pleasant emotional world for the group. I think sometimes this shows up, like, let me give an example of how I've heard this or maybe experienced it myself. Sometimes you're out as a family. Let's say you're, going on a camping trip and it rains, it's miserable, everybody's attitude is poor, and sometimes including your spouse. And women are largely tasked with changing the emotions of the group and creating a pleasant emotional world for this group, even though the circumstances are miserable. So they might, because otherwise they know if they don't take on the work of trying to manage everyone's emotions, it's going to lead to the kids fighting, possibly an argument between mom and dad. And it's just going to result in a horrible experience for everybody. So whether invisibly forging and reforging a sense of emotional self-belonging and connection in others, or silently taking unnecessary chores and activities everyone benefits from, but no one wants to do. This happens in relationships where women are trained to manage volatile moods and tempers and chronically put their significant other's feelings, experiences, and desires before their own. It also happens at work, where women, in addition to their actual job descriptions, are pushed into performing the roles of mother or sexual objects for the enjoyment of others, but rarely for any real benefit to them. It happens on our screens, where women's intellect, morality, and humanity are judged based on how these women and their expressions and their presentations make viewers feel, not what they have to say or what they've done. It even happens, like I've said, on the street. Starting at a young age, girls and women are told to smile by male strangers. Why would that matter? I remember probably was 5 or 6 years ago, I had ran out to pick up lunch for staff meeting. And, they gave me the estimated time that lunch would be ready for me to pick up. And when I got there, they said, hey, it's going to be a few more minutes. We're not quite done with it. And I said, great. And I just kind of stepped aside waiting. And in the meantime, I pulled up my phone and just started going through emails. I'm doing work while I'm waiting, because why just stand there and wait when, I can get caught up on emails. I can get caught up on some of those tasks that, fill in the hours between my day. And so I was just, on my phone, deleting some spam emails, but also like responding to some emails. And all of a sudden I hear this voice say to me, I didn't realize at first that they were talking to me, but they said, hey, you should really smile. And I kind of looked over like, who are you talking to? Who is this? What's happening over here? And it was an older man, I would say probably in his late 60s, early 70s. And he was talking to me. And I was a little stunned by this, actually. And I said something to the effect of like, I don't typically smile when I'm answering emails. And, he was just like, he stuck to his guns and was just like, well, you really should smile. It would go a long way if you smiled. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, why would you smile when you're concentrating, when I'm thinking of an appropriate response? And, the person bringing out the food, I think, heard some of this. And so he was just like, ma'am, here's your food, and kind of looked at me as I'm paying, like, that was weird, which it is weird. Like, I was an adult, like I was almost 50 years old at that point, and I'm still being told to smile while I'm concentrating on a task. This is emotional labor. It's this primordial training that before anything else, women and girls should edit the expression of their emotions to accommodate and elevate the emotions of others. Now, I will say this can also be taught to young boys, even though it's not reinforced on a systemic wide basis. But when young kids, let's say young boys, are parentified, or when the family system is unstable or abusive, kids of both genders will learn at very young ages to read the room, so to speak, and adjust their behavior to manage the emotions of one or both of their parents. And this can continue into their adult lives in several ways. So, what I've seen with men who've been put in this situation of suppressing their own emotions in order to not rock the boat in their home or with one or both parents, they may, continue this learned pattern of caretaking or people pleasing others at their own expense. They might become very uncomfortable with emotional labor, which is going to impact the relationships they're part of. They may have suppressed their emotions to the extent they are unaware of their own emotions or do not know how to take care of themselves emotionally. And last, they can continue a pattern of always filtering their emotions through the perceived emotions of others, whether they're accurate or not, right? So let me give you an example of this. So maybe my emotions are saying, I want or I need this, but the filter I'm running that through is, how is this other person going to respond? Am I going to hurt them? Am I going to make them mad? Am I going to disappoint them? Is that going to be thrown back at me? And so the way that they express their own emotions often then is filtered through that, like, what's the consequence of me saying or feeling this? Which hopefully you can see how that translates back into a pattern created in childhood. Some of the ways that this is also expressed as adults can include a fear of commitment, mental health issues, addiction, anger or rage issues, and intimacy disorders. So sociologist Arlie Hochschild coined the term emotional labor 4 decades ago to describe the skill American workers were required to perform in the service sector as it was exploding and slowly replacing manufacturing. She said, quote, a pivotal part of jobs was no longer just physical, intellectual, or even creative, but also unambiguously emotive. Employees were now expected to change the outside expression of their emotions to provoke an emotion in their clients, customers, passengers, debtors, or patients. Hochschild related this kind of work to an equivalent and feminized emotional work we had long been used to seeing women do in private, without compensation, alongside other forms of unpaid work. She continues, lacking other resources, women make a resource out of feeling and offer it to men as a gift in return for the more material resources they lack. Since the terminology of emotional labor was first introduced 4 decades ago, the study and understanding of emotional labor has largely remained relegated to academia. And this effect has been immensely detrimental to conversations that I think we urgently need to have across society about continuing these harmful inequalities with these ongoing emotional performances, and also with, many people in our society not being able to understand the emotional performances or make sense of that. The position of women in both professional and personal settings is firmly established in the world as the caregiver, the appeaser, the listener, the empath, and the subordinate. Now, let me clarify here. Is it a bad thing to express empathy? No, it's not. Is it bad to use emotions to help other people? No, it's not. But the expectation that we as women and we alone are the main bearers of this burden is no longer sustainable. Our emotional bank accounts are overdrawn, and yet our survival and advancement in this society continue to depend on us doing this invisible work. Now, one of the books I read, prior to putting together a podcast episode was a book called Emotional Labor by Rose Hackman. And she has a quote, "Such expectations point to an unsettling and enduring distribution of power. The fact that we have become inured to these expectations is not only the consequence of living in a male-dominated society. In many ways, they are one of the main reasons we are still in one." Now, over the last 100 years, we have seen profound changes in women's lives in the United States and beyond. American women were granted the right to vote in 1920, a move that initially benefited white women only, but was eventually broadened to include all women in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Women have gone from representing a third of the workforce in 1950 to just under half today. As of 2019, women represented half of the college-educated workforce. Starting in 1974, we no longer needed a husband or a male family member signature to apply for credit or a credit card. In 1972, birth control was legalized for all, and in 1973, abortion became legal, giving women greater control over their own bodies and the planning and course of their economic, social, and political lives. But as we all know, that right endured for only 50 years. In June of 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court shockingly reversed federal abortion rights, suddenly depriving millions of their right to self-determination and bodily autonomy. I remember the day that was overturned. Many of my female clients talked about it. Several of my male clients came in and, talked about it and were like, what happened? This is crazy. And I think we've been trying to make sense of it in the years that followed. How could such a snatchback in fundamental rights occur? Hadn't the issue of gender equality been settled? Well, no, it's not. We live with the illusion that we have reached gender equity in this country, but so many indicators around us point to the contrary. We are, in fact, still living in a thriving patriarchy. And that we are is a strange concept to reconcile. I remember, as the Olympics are ongoing as I am recording this podcast, and as I watched Katie Ledecky win so many awards and really be celebrated for the athlete that she is in her sport of swimming, it took me back to years ago, probably in the early 2000s, to that Olympics. And I had posted on my Facebook page, I had noticed this newspaper article, because back then newspapers were still commonly distributed and read. And so, on the front page, the main story is Michael Phelps wins silver. I think something to that effect. And, a big picture of him accepting the medal. And, he is an amazing athlete and he accomplished much in his athletic career. And I don't have any problem celebrating him and his accomplishments as an athlete. But, I'm reading this story and then I turn the page and in this small square kind of at the bottom of, I don't remember if it was the second or third page, is this like not even with a picture. It's just this small headline with a little bit underneath it that says, Katie Ledecky wins gold. And I was like, okay, wait a minute. So I took a picture of the main page. I took a picture of this small page and I posted it. And I just said, many times I don't remember exactly what I said. I could probably pull up the post, but I said something to the effect of like, oftentimes I'm accused of talking about gender inequality because I'm told that that is no longer an issue in our country. And I said, this is symbolic of the issues that we still have that are proof that gender inequality is still present in our country. And I posted it. And, I was still active in the LDS or Mormon church. And a lot of my male congregation members, which are my neighbors, right? In Utah, because of the high population of LDS people, the people that I'm neighbors with are in my ward congregation. We call it a ward in the LDS church that I go to church with. And that's not really like what you choose. You're kind of assigned to these wards based on your geographical location and how many families are in a ward, right? And so a lot of the men were just ripping me apart. Like, you're just looking for reasons to be angry. And I'm like, I'm not looking for reasons to be angry. I'm not even saying I'm angry. I'm just saying, look, here's an example. We don't have gender inequality. And some were like, Michael Phelps is an amazing athlete. Again, I'm not saying he's not. I think he has been an amazing athlete and had an amazing career. I'm just showing you, one got this splashing front page coverage for a silver medal, and one got this small corner on the second or third page for getting the gold medal. And, one of my neighbors who, he and I had some differences in the way we thought about things. This was at the time, so this will maybe put a time frame to it. This was when the Tea Party was rising in the conservative side of politics. And he was definitely a supporter of the Tea Party. And, he was definitely Republican and conservative and all of that. And he knew that I was not, that I was more progressive and more liberal leaning. And yet we had some great conversations as neighbors. He lived kitty corner from our house across the street. And I had a lot of respect for him. And I think he had a lot of respect for me. And we often had just some great conversations. And so he commented on my post and was just kind of like, hey, guys, Jackie's not criticizing Michael Phelps. She's not saying anything negative. She's just pointing out a very obvious gender inequality in this coverage in the same newspaper. He's like, why can't you see that? And, his comment pretty much got passed over by more people commenting. And so I want to say later that week, maybe 2 or 3 days later, he made his own post and he tagged me in it. And he just said, hey, I witnessed this thing with my neighbor and good friend. And he, tagged my name and shared my post. And it was just like, this is wrong for us to attack somebody for just pointing out this gender inequality. He's like, she's right. And all of you who were attacking her or criticizing her, you're wrong. And, I just really appreciated that. I told him that, in my message to him over Facebook. When I saw him later, I gave him a hug and was just like, you're such a great person. I love you. I love having you as my neighbor. Thank you so much for coming to my defense. And so again, I'm just thinking this as I'm working on this podcast episode on emotional labor, cognitive labor, and trying to just create awareness so that we can try to make that more equitable, because I believe it's healthier for our entire society to make that equitable. And to teach everybody how to do that. And then, as I'm watching the Olympics and covering that and seeing Katie Ledecky get celebrated for her for her athletic career this year in the Olympics, it just made me think of my neighbor, Jory Francis, who has passed away. And, I miss him. I'm not living in the same place, and neither is his family, but he was a great neighbor to me. To date, the United States has only ever had male heads of state. The January 2022 US Congress counted the highest number of women it had ever seen, with 149 women holding seats, representing 26.9% of all members, or just over a quarter. As of February 2022, there were 31 women holding CEO positions at Fortune 500 companies, representing an abysmally low 6.2% total. In 2021, the 10 wealthiest people in America were all men, and they're all white. On the flip side, women continue to be more likely to be living in poverty than men, and are more likely than men to be among the working poor, with the greatest rate among Black and Hispanic women. Yes, we have made progress, but ours is a society that is still plagued by male domination, and in which it is no coincidence that women are expected to take on the lion's share of emotional labor. Now, we reached a breaking point during the worst years of the COVID-19 epidemic. Economists reported that women quit their jobs at twice the rate men did. By the beginning of 2022, while men had recouped job losses, there were still 1 million fewer women in the workforce than 2 years prior. In just a couple of years, women's economic advancement was said to have been set back by a generation. And this disparity was due to women being far more concentrated in the lowest paying, high contact service jobs on the front lines of the epidemic. And it was also due to women being far more likely to assume increased childcare and caregiving responsibilities. These crises only exacerbated what had silently and inequitably long been going on. Women may have entered the formal workplace alongside men. However, they are still expected to provide almost all of the unpaid or underpaid support work that enables economies to function in the first place. This includes child and elderly care, domestic and family work, and community work, keeping relationships and societies alive and connected. Now, I've talked before in many podcast episodes about the fact that little humans need to be fed, dressed, housed, educated, tended to, and cared for. And as they get older, they also need to feel meaning, belonging, and connection to be able to function. In an economy, this support work is extraordinarily valuable, even as it is often unseen, unrecognized, and unrewarded. We continue to take work deemed feminine for granted so that it is ripe for extraction. In the words of radical feminist Heidi Hartman, she says, quote, "The material base upon which patriarchy rests lies most fundamentally in men's control over women's labor power." One of the hollow tricks of patriarchy is that it transforms all work deemed feminine into fixed subliminal expressions of femininity. However, much of that work involves active time, effort, and skill. The best way to maintain a system in which women work for little to nothing and for the benefit of others, especially men, is to convince society that they are not working at all. End quote. So she is saying at the heart of the system lies emotional labor, the most invisible and insidious form of shadow work expected of women and extracted for the benefit of men and society. Now, emotional labor does not encompass all support work that enables our society and our formal economy to function, but it is a heavy component of much of it. It is its standalone form of work and the impetus behind much unpaid work that continues to be done. Putting other people's feelings first and crafting meaningful emotional ties between humans is a huge part of care work. Child rearing, connective community work, and putting other people's feelings first are often why a woman is expected to take on more tasks and responsibilities that are not strictly emotional. For example, being the one who drives children to practice on weekends, turning down a promotion because it would make doing the emotional labor at home difficult, and going part-time in their jobs because they're overwhelmed with both the emotional labor at home and the work that they're involved in. Buying gifts or sending cards to a relative, planning and shopping for meals for the week, packing lunches. Emotional labor relies on the fundamental understanding that women should prioritize other people's experiences before their own emotional labor. They're still required to do their own emotional labor, but they also take on the emotional labor of other people. What happens when women are expected to provide emotional labor and men are not is a basic acceptance that a man's existence is to be protected as a priority over a woman. This system is one in which men's quality of life matters and women are put to work for it. The ability to change, mask, or suppress the expression of our authentic emotions is a uniquely human characteristic. Is a uniquely human characteristic. All of us, both males and females, can laugh to suit a situation, even if we don't find it really that funny. We can appear despondent to suit another when inside maybe we're fine, we might be content or appear passively pleasant in situations in between. We can all do this and engage in it to varying degrees all the time. At work, the expectation that people should do the emotional labor. Okay, starting over, back to appear. We can appear despondent to suit another when inside that's not our actual authentic feeling. We can laugh and appear passively pleasant in situations. We can all do this and we can engage in it to varying degrees all the time. At work, the expectation that people should do the emotional labor to put on a professional face is not something reserved for just women. Being professional will likely include a basic level of politeness, the exchange of a few formal niceties, greetings, a smile, maybe a question or two about the weekend. There will likely be the expectation of level-headedness and an evening or modulating of the temperature of emotional expression and communications, whether that's in person, over the phone, or over email. We're not supposed to be too hot, angry, not too cold, and abrupt. And that can be applied both to males and females. It's just kind of considered professional behavior. However, because deference and filtering of emotions go with power in traditional work environments, the higher up you go, the less emotional labor you have to do. So an intern will be expected to be more deferential than a junior associate, who will be more deferential than a vice president, who will be more deferential than the founder and CEO. And this holds until you introduce elements of gender expression and identity, race, and class as further and less linear expressions of power. So a male junior associate might get away with being abrupt with colleagues, whereas a female senior associate will not. A white male associate may feel free to quiet down, while a white male associate may feel free to speak loudly and animatedly with colleagues, whereas a black male associate may be told to quiet down and even be issued a warning. Now, it has been almost 3 decades since journalist Daniel Goleman first published his best-selling book, Emotional Intelligence, which shines a light on the value of non-intellectual emotional traits in business contexts. The book made a case that resonated with many and has only continued to be backed by research since then. Being self-aware, self-regulated, motivated, empathetic, and having good social skills at work makes for better workers, makes for better work environments, and crucially, it makes for better leaders. The choice to talk about emotional intelligence as a set of traits desirable in leadership, rather than the emotional labor as the act of putting emotional intelligence to work, was significant. Rose Hackman talked about this in her book, Emotional Labor. She said, while the cultural movement resulting from the book was pivotal for the valuing of emotional literacy, generally its narrow focus on upward mobility in white-collar industries sidestepped what could have been a radically transformative conversation for all workplaces. Such a lapse hindered a deep power analysis of the workplace and obscured the coercive emotional labor already being done by those at the margins. Failing to treat emotional intelligence and action as a form of work that requires time, effort, and skill, the same way other forms of work do, meant that only some select workers were lauded for their performance, and then not marking its existence at all in ranks of all industries, such as white-collar service, healthcare, and beyond. We stopped short of intentionally shifting towards a culture of rewarding emotional labor rather than offloading it. She continues, it's not that it inherently points to an injustice when seen, valued, appreciated, or part of an exchange. A mutuality, an ecosystem where love is power, shouldn't be exploitative. Quite the contrary. Doing emotional labor for people doing it for you is the goal, not the problem. We must connect the dots if we are to expose the problem and heal. Over the last 10 years, the field of neuroscience has moved away from understanding emotions as innate, universal, kind of this stamped on the brain from birth. Instead, it now sees emotions as brain creations influenced by the constant active absorption of the world around us through our five senses, mixed with predictions based on experience. So if emotions don't happen like a sneeze or a knee jerk, but are instead constructed by our brain itself, reflecting information it has collected from the broader environment, emotional labor describes the part of the process through which emotions are not just produced, but they're managed. As our brain manages the production of emotions, it pays attention to context, it understands the nuances of appropriateness, or the weight of expectations. It's aware of conventions, of feelings that dictate that we should feel happy at a party, sad during a wake, even when our internal emotions don't match that occasion. We are aware of cultural display rules that will guide us to appear somber as a form of respect, even if we are not internally feeling desolate at that wake. When we assess our surroundings and modulate our emotional display, or even our actual emotions, to suit and interact with the context that we're in. In sociology, tweaking your internal feelings to match the situation is referred to as deep acting. And tweaking the display of them on the surface is referred to as surface acting. Both are forms of emotional labor. I want to talk for a minute about feeling rules. So again, you'll start to see these once you understand the concept. So feeling rules, which consider the situation and conventions, can be different for two people in the same social context. Feeling rules are often vastly different for women than they are for men. And then they're also vastly different for minority women, women of color, than they are for white women. And also vice versa for men. There is a quote I did not attribute it to somebody, so my apologies. But it says, quote, while men are limited from childhood in the range of emotion they are expected to have, they are paradoxically given more space to be unfiltered in public. Women are treated like emotional thermostats, whether they like it or not. They not only must constantly manage their feelings, but they are also held responsible for the feelings of others, end quote. Now, in recent popular memory, nowhere was this kind of feeling rule, double standard, more evident than during the September 2018 public confirmation hearings of now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh and his sexual assault accuser, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. Now, this confirmation hearing was watched by an estimated 20 million people across America on the morning of September 27th, 2018. Dr. Ford, who was clearly emotionally affected, but never overrun by her emotions, gave a clear testimony of her alleged assault at the hands of then Judge Kavanaugh and a friend while they were all teenagers. Not once did she raise her voice, and every detail of her interaction with the Senate Judicial Committee was polite, deferential, and sweet. From asking for a Coke, where she said, quote, "I think after I read my opening statement, I anticipate needing some caffeine if that is available," end quote. To putting her question of their needs before her own when they proposed a break. She would say, "Does that work for you?" instead of saying, "I need a break." Peppered throughout her heart-wrenching testimony was a constant lowering of the gaze. She's following these feeling rules. She can't meet them directly with direct eye contact. She can't stare at them, because that would be, then she'd be accused of being hostile, angry, that type of stuff. So as she was going through her testimony, there was a constant lowering of the gaze. And in the afternoon, an angry and at times tearful Kavanaugh gave his own roaring, combative testimony. He raised his voice constantly. When it came to questioning, Kavanaugh was elusive, he was unaccommodating, he was interrupting, he was rude, and at times bullying. And it seemed to me he was also lying. Kavanaugh's gaze remained undaunted, his eyes looking straight ahead at the Senate Judiciary Committee. When Senator Amy Klobuchar probed him on whether there was any time drinking had caused him to forget what had happened or part of what had happened, he answered provocatively, quote, "You're talking about a blackout? I don't know. Have you?" End quote. After she insisted he answer her question, his interjection doubled down on insolence. He said, quote, "Yeah, and I'm curious if you have," end quote. Kavanaugh was not only being the opposite of deferential, but was flaunting the disrespectful and belittling of the senator. In fact, Kavanaugh refused to answer dozens of questions that were asked of him, whereas Ford dodged none. This juxtaposition of their two testimonies make for a perfect example of how two members with the same background are often encouraged to adhere to entirely opposing feeling rules. Both Ford and Kavanaugh are of a similar origin class. They're white. They were privately educated, both enjoying privileged socioeconomic status, which they have maintained in part by reaching the highest levels in their respective professional fields of psychology and law. The contrast in their unambiguously unequal emotional display can be boiled down to one key difference: gender. Ford, who is a well-respected professor of psychology at Palo Alto University and a researcher at Stanford University, could never have behaved the way Kavanaugh did and remain credible. Everything about her demeanor and expression was the emblem of what is expected and allowed of a woman in public. She had to be not only likable, but amenable, to put others' needs before her own. Taking cues from cultural display rules becomes how women are forced to express their place in the hierarchy. Serving others as a priority, that is the only way women are given space. And as perfect as her gendered performance was, Ford's testimony was ultimately disregarded. Although privately, she was told many believed her on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Compliant submission may prevent women from being booted out or discredited entirely, but it also minimizes any challenge to existing power structures. Now, I was working that day during the confirmation hearing of Brett Kavanaugh, and I had several female clients scheduled that day. And, I felt like I was getting hour by hour updates about how it was going. Many of them came in quite triggered during Judge Kavanaugh's testimony. They definitely resonated with what they were seeing on their TV screens. I would watch it, like if I had a free hour or something like that, I would watch it. And again, I saw the same. I don't know that many of my female clients or myself did not recognize the rules that she was trying to follow and the rules that he could blatantly disregard. It's interesting. I was also, so this month, well, no, it's August, last month in July. So Utah has a national holiday, or not a national, sorry, I'm getting my words messed up. Utah has a state holiday, July 24th. And so my family, my brothers and sisters, cousins, nieces and nephews, that type of stuff, we have a tradition. I mean, it's super hot in July. I think that day it was like estimated to be, or it was predicted to be 103, 104, something like that, just miserable. And so we typically rent one of those big blow up, like bounce house kind of things, but it's not a bounce house. It's a big blow up water slide, right? So we can play in the water and whatever and sit around, visit. And so we did that on July 24th. Shortly after President Joe Biden had stepped down from his campaign for re-election and had endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris in her run for president. And so at one point, I'm inside trying to get a break from the heat. And my brother-in-law was in there. My sister-in-law was in there. And so we were just talking about that development because it was, pretty fresh, new. And so we were just talking about that. It might have even been just a couple of days after. I don't remember the dates. So, she was just mentioning, she was like, I have never liked Vice President Harris. And, my brother-in-law was like, why not? And she was like, well, I didn't really know much about her until the 2018 confirmation hearing of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. And I was kind of like, my ears perk up, right? I was part of the conversation, but I'm like, what? Because that morning, I kind of had a slower morning because I wasn't getting ready for work or anything. And so I had actually pulled up Kamala questioning him and challenging him as part of his confirmation hearing. And I remember watching that back in 2018, and I just wanted to refresh my memory now that she was a presidential likely nominee. And so I'm listening to my sister-in-law, and she's like, I just found in 2018 when I was watching that confirmation hearing, I felt like she didn't take it seriously. She was bullying. She was rude to Brett Kavanaugh. And like, I'm just like, I can't believe what I'm hearing. And so I spoke up and I said, oh, I actually was watching those video clips just this morning. And I said, I don't think she was bullying Brett Kavanaugh at all. I said, he was dodging her questions. He was acting like he couldn't even understand her very direct, clearly worded questions. And I think he knew he was lying and she knew he was lying. And I'm sure that was frustrating, but I don't think she was bullying him at all. And, my sister-in-law was like, well, I'll go back and watch those videos on YouTube because it might be good to get a second look. She's like, that was just my impression back then. And and so she's like, I will say since, President Biden stepped down and it looks like Vice President Harris is going to be the nominee on the Democratic side. She's like, I have felt some hope. I have felt some excitement. She's like, so, if that's a sign of anything, I went from really not liking her and having an awful taste in my mouth about her to actually feeling some hope and maybe some excitement. So again, to me, it was fairly obvious even back in 2018. And it was obvious to my female clients coming in who were talking about it. I don't recall any of my male clients talking about it at all. But, also maybe they weren't watching it that day. And so, it was just really interesting because, again, back then, Senator Harris had a different responsibility, certainly than Dr. Ford. And I think she came across intelligent and strong in her questions. But this she wasn't taking it serious. She was rude. She was a bully. That I just never saw, including that morning when I went back and was watching those videos. Almost 4 years later, after Kavanaugh's confirmation, the nation also watched Senate confirmation hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first Black female nominee to the United States Supreme Court. The gender double standards on display were compounded with a double standard of race. Jackson's countenance as she faced, at times, mocking and aggressive questions from male members of the committee was a discouraging reminder that while this was a historic moment, Black women particularly still faced perpetual public indignities, however polished or impressive their track records were. And hers are polished and impressive. Her composure and endurance as she maintained an emotional evenness over days were rightfully lauded. But it was hard not just to see the moment as a public exhibition in racial and sexist abuse performed with impunity, as well as a woman in her position having not had much of a choice of whether she endured that, whether she accepted that treatment or not. A woman in her position would not have a choice over her response. For women who are not white and for people from minority groups, pretty groups, prioritizing the feelings of people from more socially dominant groups, whether white people, men, or both, can present itself as a precondition for taking up any public space, even though there is a cost to themselves. So I want to talk for a minute about alexithymia. Alexithymia is a term describing problems with feeling emotions. In Greek, it loosely translates to no words for emotion. Peter Sifnios, not sure if I'm pronouncing that last name right. Peter Sifnios, a psychiatrist and professor emeritus of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, first described alexithymia in the early 1970s. The word comes from, like I said, it has Greek origin, meaning lack, lexis, and word, thymos, meaning emotion. Overall, it means having a lack of words for emotions. People with alexithymia have what we describe problems with introspection, problems with observing their own mental and emotional processes. They can experience confusion around bodily sensations that are connected to emotions, and they struggle to communicate their emotions to others. Alexithymia also makes it difficult for people to identify and respond to emotions in others, or a word that we might use is empathy, which is emotional understanding. These issues can lead to difficulties in social settings and in interpersonal relationships. Now, everyone can struggle with alexithymia, but it has also been observed that one subsection of the population struggles more than others. Research suggests that men have a greater difficulty expressing emotions, and this has come to be known as male normative alexithymia, or MNA. Now, maybe they felt overwhelmed in the moment. Maybe they didn't have enough time to process the situation to adequately describe how they felt about it. That happens. And sometimes when enough time passes, many people who struggle with alexithymia are able to describe or express how they felt about a given situation. For many, describing and expressing emotions comes naturally. However, there is a percentage of the population, it's estimated to be around 10%, with levels of alexithymia considered significant enough to cause difficulties in their lives. Now, alexithymia is not a diagnosable condition or a disorder. It's considered a subclinical phenomenon. Alexithymia can be conceptualized as a dimensional personality trait involving cognitive and emotional deficits. It's a way of describing a part of who a person is that can be measured on a scale, like how we can measure how tall we are or how much we weigh. People can have a range of alexithymia from just a little to a lot. And like I said, there is a difference between men and women, with one study that found a prevalent rate of alexithymia in men to be almost twice that of women. Now, male normative alexithymia was a term created by researcher and psychologist Dr. Ronald Levant in a 1992 scientific paper. He proposed that MNA hypothesis to account for his observations of many men who learned to hide or not express their feelings because they believed it's what they should do as a man. Levant observed that men had great difficulty finding the words to describe their emotional states and that they required a lot of practice to do so. He theorized that those men had been discouraged as boys from expressing and talking about their emotions, or even punished for doing so. Hence, these men did not develop an understanding of many of their emotions. In particular, these men showed the greatest deficits with more vulnerable emotions like sadness or fear. MNA is more prevalent in men, although it is considered normative. It's not normal. It's considered normative because it is rooted in a common cultural expectation that men should not express their emotions as much as women do. But it's not normal or natural because society shapes and forms it. Society has set this standard or norm that influences men's behavior. There's two theories that are considered when looking at MNA. Social learning theory is a psychological theory that explains how people learn from observing and imitating the behavior of others around them. So according to this theory, individuals learn new behaviors by watching the consequences that others experience after exhibiting those behaviors. Social learning theory suggests that learning occurs through social interaction, observation, and imitation. According to social learning theory, men may learn to suppress their emotions by observing other men in their lives, such as fathers, brothers, peers, who model similar behavior. For example, a boy growing up in a family or social environment where expressions of emotions are discouraged or viewed as a sign of weakness can learn to suppress his emotions to fit in and be accepted. He may observe the men who exhibit similar behaviors, such as not showing vulnerability, and imitate this behavior to be seen as masculine or tough. As a result, he may struggle to recognize and express his emotions as an adult. In addition, social learning theory can also explain how this pattern of behavior is perpetuated over time. As more men exhibit this behavior, it becomes more normalized and expected, and other men may feel pressure to conform to these norms to fit in and be accepted by their peers. This can create a cycle where the pattern of suppressing emotions becomes deeply ingrained in the culture and society. The second theory that can be looked at in explaining MNA is the gender role strain paradigm. So this is a dominant theoretical perspective. This perspective posits that society shapes boys into men who conform to traditional masculine gender roles by raising them under the influence of traditional masculine ideology. In fact, research has shown the greater one endorses traditional masculinity, the higher levels of alexithymia are observed in addition to interpersonal difficulties. In fact, research has shown the greater one endorses traditional masculinity, the higher levels of alexithymia are observed in addition to interpersonal difficulties. So this theory directly confronts the popular opinion of, or stereotype in society, that boys are hardwired to be less emotional and more logical than girls or women. This theory directly refutes that. There is evidence that suggests boys actually start life with greater emotional reactivity and expressiveness than girls do. However, they become less verbally expressive than girls at about the age of 2 years, and they become less facially expressive by 6 years. This developmental change suggests that socialization shapes gender-appropriate emotional behavior and may account for gender differences in emotional awareness and expressivity. According to the research, men are socialized to be this way, and this explains why MNA is not natural, nor is it normal. Now, it might be adaptive, and we can see that from an evolutionary perspective. It can help in highly competitive environments to not show weakness. It can hide vulnerability, and it can be used to establish and maintain power. But there are negative effects on men's mental health. Male normative alexithymia can have a significant impact on men's mental health. This is something I have personally observed in my therapy work with male clients. It can lead to the following: difficulty identifying and expressing emotions, which can enhance stress, anxiety, and depression. It can lead to problems in relationships, where partners may struggle to understand what their male partners are feeling. This will get in the way of connection, closeness. In some cases, men may turn to substance abuse or other unhealthy coping mechanisms, or what I like to call maladaptive coping mechanisms, to deal with their emotions because they have not learned healthy or productive ways of coping. Now, I want to shift a little bit and talk about how, whether it's male normative alexithymia or the lack of being told or taught how to do emotional labor, an unawareness of the mental labor that happens and that they actually should be a contributor of that. I want to shift a little bit from talking about it publicly and in the work environment to talking about how this can impact personal relationships and how the expectations and feeling rules that are at work and are seen in public also show up in much the same way at home. Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "One of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with the resignation of power and power with a denial of love." So yeah, think about that for a minute, right? If love is identified with the resignation of power, or I'm giving up some power, or maybe I'm giving power to another, who would that describe, right? That's not describing men, that's describing women. And so being loving, performing the mental labor, performing the emotional labor is seen as love. Having power is associated with a denial of love. So, for men who are expected to have power or who have been socialized to take power or to seek out power, there's going to be a denial of love, which is a feeling of more vulnerability. I think this concept has relevance when we talk about sexual addiction, has relevance when we talk about intimacy disorders. There's another quote by Bell Hooks. She says, "To begin by always thinking of love as an action rather than a feeling is one way in which anyone using the word in this manner automatically assumes accountability and responsibility." Now, I think this quote emphasizes the idea that love should be understood and practiced as an active commitment rather than just an emotional state. So I know in other languages, I don't really speak other languages, took some Spanish classes. I think I've mentioned my Spanish teacher did not like me, and I didn't really care for her either. And so, Spanish was not that great either. But I know in other cultures, in other languages, there can be many different words for love. And in English, we have one word, right? I can love a hamburger. I can love sports teams. I can love my dog. I can love my romantic and sexual partner. And I can love my kids. And it's all the same word, which I think also contributes to this idea that she talks about, of thinking of love. We need to think of love as an action rather than just this feeling. If we just think of love as a feeling with a hamburger, not a problem. If I think of, the rest would probably require some action. If I love my dog, then there's some action involved, or there should be. I think a lot of people get dogs and there is no action really involved in being responsible and accountable for their caretaking, which makes me always wonder why they got a dog in the first place. But, when we start to think of love as an action rather than just a feeling, maybe we used to hear these things like kind of jokes that I think set up men to be, oh gosh, there used to be kind of around, I want to say 2010, there was a term that was used. The term, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, it was a term that was a bumbler. And it kind of was used, I mean, it was used to describe men who basically just don't get it, right? Maybe they don't get emotional labor, they don't understand their own feelings. And so, that term was used. I mean, I didn't necessarily use it, but I saw it being used in some of the platforms. I saw some articles about, men as bumblers. Just that idea, like it made me think of in the Popeye cartoon, what was the guy's name that was like, I'll gladly pay you tomorrow for a hamburger today? Kind of just reminded me of that guy, the way that, when I was reading certain articles about that, which I think was insulting, like I didn't, again, I didn't use that term. I understood what it was and I read some things about it, but I also felt like it was cruel and not really, I mean, maybe captured the behavior of some men, but certainly not all men. So let's break down the meaning of this quote by Bell Hooks. So Bell Hooks suggests that love should be seen as something we do, not just something we feel. If I, this is what I was talking about. Like there used to be kind of that joke, like the husband would say to the wife, like, I told you on the day we got married, I love you. And if that ever changes, I'll let you know. Kind of meaning like, why would I need to continue to tell you that I love you? Again, when we maybe look a little bit deeper at that joke, what it maybe was implying is this concept of love is just a feeling, but the wife constantly asking, do you love me? Do you care about me? Maybe because that feeling was not put into action. So putting it into action would include concrete actions like caring, supporting, being interested in, and respect. It would move beyond the notion of love as merely a sentimental or a passive feeling. So let's talk about, like by framing love as an action, individuals are prompted to take responsibility for how they express and demonstrate love in their relationships. It implies that loving someone involves intentional effort and behavior that nurture and sustain the relationship, and that this should be both ways, a two-way situation, not just a one-way. Viewing love as an action also encourages people to reflect on their behavior and its impact on others. It calls for a conscious and ethical approach to relationships, where one is accountable for their actions and the well-being of others. In essence, the quote advocates for a deeper, more committed understanding of love, one that requires active participation and ethical responsibility in our interactions and relationships. So several years ago, this maybe would have been 2021, maybe later 2021, when things were somewhat opening, the COVID vaccination was available. And so the lockdown restrictions weren't quite as strict. And I was seeing clients in person again. I think we were wearing masks. I was still seeing some online, but I was seeing some in person. For my whole career, I think in therapy, it's likely that you're going to work some evening hours. I've always, like, since my first job, I have had to work some evening hours. That's when people can do group therapy. It's when some people they need to schedule after work. Not everybody's able to have the flexibility in their employment to come during the day or in the morning. And so, I've always worked an evening appointment, or, I try to get in like a 4, 5, and 6 appointment and be done by 7. Now, when our kids were young, I worked part-time. I usually worked like 19, 20 hours a week, and I would divide that between 2 days. So those were really long days, but I would not work in the morning. I would get my kids ready for school. I'd kind of get some things done around the house. And then I would usually go to work maybe at noon or 1. And then my husband would get off. He would go in earlier, like real early. And then he would get off maybe 2 or 3. So he was home when the kids were getting home from work and, could get them started on homework and be there supervising and overseeing what's going on. And so that, that kind of started out necessarily. It just was what we needed to reduce the cost of daycare and, to have more parental involvement with our kids. But that's still similar. I still usually when we have groups running at our practice, I run a group. And so that night I might be getting off at 9, home by, 9:30, sometimes 10 if I stay and talk to Rachel. And, the other nights I'm usually getting home at, maybe 6, maybe 6:30 if I'm done at 6, or 7:30 if I'm done at 7. And, I have to say, like, I'm a pretty good cook. My husband's a pretty good cook. He is comfortable in the kitchen. He's comfortable with a recipe, maybe not any recipe, or maybe not quite to the comfort level that I am, but he can cook. And, that was something that was necessary on the days when our kids were young and I was working till 10 p.m. And, if the kids got fed, it was up to him. And so he had to cook. And so we will pretty much share that somewhat equally. I still plan out the meals. I still, make the grocery list so we have the ingredients that we need to make the meals for the week. And so this had been happening for several, maybe even months, at least several weeks, where I would get home 7:30 or 8, and I am starving. I'm ravenous. I haven't usually had a chance to eat since lunch, and I'm starving. And I come home and he hasn't cooked. I mean, our kids are older, right? Our kids may or may not even be there for dinner because they're, some of them didn't live there anymore and some were out and whatever. And so he'd just be home, and maybe he fixed himself something for dinner. But I would come home and, like, if I wanted to eat something, I would have to make it. So usually I'm relying on toast or, something that I can, like, just put together. Like I like to eat granola. So I might, put some nuts in it, put some berries in it. I don't like yogurt and I don't like milk. I do like almond milk, so I'll put that in it and kind of eat it. But again, nothing, nothing super filling, not feeling, but filling. And one night I came home and I was just so angry. And part of that, I was probably hangry. And I was just like, look, on the nights that I don't work, so I get off early on Friday. I don't work Saturday, Sunday. Monday, I work from home. I usually do podcast stuff or YouTube stuff. So I'm working from home. So, that's like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, 4 nights of the week. So 3 nights that you would be in charge of the meal for dinner, and you do nothing. Or you make something that I don't like. My husband loves lentils over rice. I don't like lentils. And so he might have made lentils for him and our vegetarian daughter, which I don't need meat in all of my meals, but I'm like, why would you make something I don't like? It's not like I'm out of town. I'm going to come home and I'm going to be hungry. I was just so mad, and I, kind of said that to him, and I left, and I went and got myself something to eat. I went and got some takeout and came home. I mean, I wasn't screaming or anything, but I was just like, what are you thinking? Like, do you have no awareness that, like, I'm getting home sometimes at 8 o'clock at night, I'm starving, and you don't feel any responsibility in making dinner? Like, not just for yourself, but for me to have something when I get home. And I was just so mad. I left. I went and got myself some dinner. And I will say, after that, on the nights I'm working late, or, later than him, because he typically, he sometimes might even leave work at 3 and work 2 hours at home, or 4. And so he's getting home in plenty of time to cook something. And so he started paying attention, and he started like, okay, what's for dinner tonight? And okay, or can you send me that recipe? And I would do that. And I will say, since then, he's done a much better job of, like, just having that awareness that, like, hey, it's not just my job to provide an evening meal before we go to bed. And so that was great. And I told him, I appreciate you hearing me. I appreciate you recognizing this and doing better. I appreciate that. And then, a little bit more time goes by, I don't know, 6 months, maybe a year. And again, he would say, what are we having for dinner? Or sometimes when I'm making out the meal plan for the week, and I might say to him, because honestly, for a lot of women who cook, one of the worst parts of that is planning the meals, making sure everybody likes it. I have a, daughter who is gluten-free because she has celiacs. She's also vegetarian, which is a very hard combination. I have another daughter that doesn't like certain things. She likes most things, but certain things she doesn't like. So I'm always taking that into account when I'm meal planning, like what is she going to eat and what's this one going to eat? And so, typically I might say to my husband, like, what do you want for dinner this week? And he would often say, this is his patent response, chicken tacos. And so I just said to him, like, we cannot have chicken tacos all the time. Like, I need you to come up with some different ideas. If we had chicken tacos every night, after a certain amount of time, we would not like chicken tacos anymore. I need more than chicken tacos from you. And, I kind of just said, look, I don't like planning out the meals, but I'm taking into account this daughter's eating restrictions, and I'm taking into account this daughter's likes and dislikes, and some variety, and just having different things. And like, why does that always fall to me? Why is that only on me to figure out what we're having for dinner? And I also know if I ask you, all I'm going to get is chicken tacos, which I already know what you're going to say. I'm not asking you to hear chicken tacos. And, I was probably saying it just like I'm saying it in this podcast. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't being mean. And he kind of laughed and was like, I do like chicken tacos. And I'm like, right, but if we had it all the time, you probably wouldn't like chicken tacos all the time. And so, again, he's done better. And he's like, you're right. I don't know why for all these years of marriage, it's largely on you to figure out meals. And like, yeah, that's not fair. That's not okay. And I need to be involved, and I need to have more ideas than chicken tacos. And I need to take into account what eating restrictions our one daughter has, what likes and dislikes another one has, and just making sure that there's a well-balanced, healthy meal that everybody can have. And he's like, you're right. And I need to do better, which again is great. That goes a long way for me, having that patience, knowing that if I bring it up and I say something, he'll hear it and he'll be like, yeah, that's not fair. That's not okay. So like I said, I think that quote by Bell Hooks advocates for a deeper, more committed understanding of love that requires active participation. It requires responsibility, both in our interactions and our relationships. Bell Hooks has another quote where she says, quote, patriarchy, like any system of domination, for example, racism, relies on socializing everyone to believe that in all human relations, there is an inferior and a superior party. One person is strong and the other is weak, and that it is therefore natural for the powerful to rule. For the powerful, to those who support patriarchal thinking, maintaining power and control is acceptable by whatever means. And then I want to include another quote by Marilyn Strathern. She says, complementarity is a common mask for inequality. So complementarity, let's talk about that for a minute, kind of means that like men and women are different, but their differences complement each other. That's the idea of complementarity. So she says, complementarity is a common mask for inequality in what is presumed to be owing between people, both in display and in the deep acts that sustain it, end quote. So again, let's break down the meaning of this quote by Marilyn Strathern. So the term, like I said, complementarity, suggests that different roles or attributes complement each other in a seemingly balanced way. So for example, in traditional gender roles, men and women may be seen as complementing each other with different skills or responsibilities. However, Strathern argues that this idea of complementarity can actually mask inequalities. It can create an appearance of balance or mutual benefit while obscuring the fact that the roles are not equally valued or rewarded. And then the phrase, in what is presumed to be owing between people. Let's talk about that. That refers to expectations about what each person should contribute or receive in a relationship. So complementarity can hide the fact that these contributions and expectations are not always equal. For instance, in many cultures, the work typically done by women, such as caregiving and domestic tasks, is often undervalued compared to work traditionally done by men, despite it's also being essential. And again, going back to some of the research, when it talks about when we make that domestic work or that caregiving work part of the God-given strengths or skills or roles that women have, then yeah, that can exacerbate why it's not valued, why it's not really seen, and why it's often invisible, because that's just what God made women to do, right? This is also, I think we're gaining more awareness of this when men would talk about like, oh, I can't do that because I've got to babysit my kids, where, babysitting your own kids is not actually called babysitting. Babysitting is what we do with other people's kids. When you're taking care of your own kids, that's called parenting. Another example of that is, when fathers are involved in their kids' upbringing, when they, can emotionally show up, when they, all of that, it's lauded like this amazing thing. Like, you're such an amazing man for showing interest in your children and being involved in their lives. Whereas, women who are involved and show interest and love their kids, it's not like really seen as this amazing thing. It's just seen as, yeah, that's what you should do. That's what you were made to do. And so it's so outstanding and so amazing when a dad does that. I remember several years ago, my youngest daughter had to have surgery on her nose. She had a deviated septum for a long time, but they didn't want to do surgery until she was like 18, I think, or she might have been 19, when, kind of those facial bones were pretty much done growing. And so it wasn't likely to, if they did the surgery much sooner, probably wouldn't last, and they'd have to redo another surgery as she was an adult. So she was 18, 19. I think it was the summer after she graduated high school. So probably 18. And so, there were follow-up visits, and the surgeon who had done the surgery was at two different offices in two different locations on different days. And so, and we had to go like 2 days a week. And so on one day of the week, it was closer to where my work was, and I would take her. And on the other day, it was closer to where my husband worked, and so he would take her. And so we kind of split those, that responsibility of follow-up with the surgeon and making sure everything was going well and the healing was happening. And so one time I'm at the appointment with my daughter, and I'm talking to the doctor, and I said something like, well, my husband, Grace's dad, that's my daughter, Grace's dad, said blah, 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 right, about the last appointment, or wanted me to tell you whatever. I don't remember. And he was like, oh, you two are married? And I was a little bit surprised at that question. And I said, yeah. And he kind of laughed, and he's like, I assumed you were divorced, and on dad's parenting time, he brought her, and on your parenting time, you brought her. And I kind of laughed, and I said, yeah, that's probably a fair assumption. I said, but actually it's just where you're at, which office you're at, and where that is in terms of whose work is closer, so we can leave and pick her up and take her to the appointment. And he was just like, yeah, That is not a common assumption in my field. He's like, I don't often see dads at appointments for kids. And, he was like, I mean, that's sad. And I think that's great that you guys do that. But like, that's not common unless parents are divorced. So the other thing Strathern distinguishes between is display, which refers to outward appearances of roles and relationships, and deep acts, which are the fundamental actions and structures that sustain these roles. The inequality is not just in the visible aspects, but it's also embedded in the underlying practices and systems that support these roles. So again, in summary, this quote critiques the idea that complementarity in roles or relationships is inherently fair or equal. It suggests that what might appear as complementary can actually perpetuate inequality, both in visible ways and in the more profound structural elements of how relationships and social roles are organized. You may have also seen research that says men who are in long-term relationships have a longer life experience, you may have seen research that states men who have long-term relationships have a longer life expectancy, but women who are in long-term relationships actually have a shorter life expectancy, and their life expectancy increases when they're single. Now, it has been speculated that some of those findings in the research breaks out to this very thing I'm talking about: emotional labor, mental labor, and the taxing work that is for women. And when men are in relationships, they're not doing that taxing work. They're not even doing their own emotional labor. And women are doing both their emotional labor as well as their spouse's emotional labor. Now, one of the things that I love about co-facilitating men's groups in our mental health clinic is I love seeing them open up and get vulnerable with each other, which leads to a connection that they have with each other. And that connection is both in and out of group. I have a client who is in a men's group, and he's probably the youngest person in that particular men's group. I think at the time he was like 31. And there was another man in the group who was the oldest man in the group. I think he was in his 70s. And, those two got paired up to be buddies, which includes a phone call for the week and to kind of talk about or follow up with what was talked about in group, as well as just sharing where they're at emotionally, what's going on for them, how they're doing recovery wise. And so those two were paired. And, my client told me, the youngest one in the group told me, I'm really nervous about calling him. I'm the youngest person. He's the oldest person in the group. And the older man in the group was not my client, so I don't know what he was saying. But they had a phone call, and he came in that next week, and he's like, we talked for over 2 hours. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah. And it was great. And so, as group went on and he would talk and he would tell me, I call him or he calls me, even we aren't paired to talk that week. He's like, I've never been paired with him again, but I talk to him every week, sometimes multiple times a week, whether that's because I call him or he calls me. And he's like, I never thought that I would connect so well with somebody who was so much older than me. But he said, we had this conversation in one of their phone calls where, the older man in sex addiction recovery had a son who the relationship was damaged. I think they were not really in a lot of contact, probably as a result of some of his sexual addiction and the damage that he caused in his, family relationships. And the younger client had a dad who was his parents, divorced very, very early for him. And dad lived further away, and Dad's not really emotionally aware. And so, he would say, like, I probably talk to my dad 2 or 3 times a year. And, he would, because our phones can tell us how long a conversation is. He's like, the longest conversation I had with my dad this past year was 7 minutes, which was sad to him and not what he wanted. He wanted a deeper, closer relationship with his dad. And the two of them talked about that fact that, like, this older man had a wound around his son, kind of cutting him out of his life. And this younger man had a wound around dad not really being there ever in his life. I mean, he was there, but not very often, not frequently. He didn't live close, didn't really do a lot of phone calls. And, they had that connection, which I thought was very awesome and healing for both of them. I often will tell them I'm privileged to see the emotional work that they're learning to do as part of their recovery process, which is an essential part of recovery. And I also want to emphasize that connection would not happen if they were not learning to do their emotional work and be vulnerable with each other. And more than one has stated in the group that even though they finish their individual work, they have some long-term sobriety, they have a good recovery program, they actually keep coming to the group because they need this in their life. And they don't have other avenues of meeting these needs or talking with other men or talking in vulnerable ways with other men. This is the only place they know where they can have that. And they're recognizing the need for that and the value that comes with that. Often they'll talk about how their spouses see the benefits of that and the importance of that. So I want to wrap up because I've been working on this podcast episode for 2 months. I feel like there's so much information that went into this episode. And so I want to talk about this particular podcast episode from probably my all-time. I love podcasts. I listen to a whole lot of podcasts on a range of topics, but probably my all-time favorite podcast is You're Wrong About with Sarah Marshall. And she had a guest on who's been on multiple podcast episodes, Sarah Archer. And this particular podcast episode was on the rise of the trad wife. So the term trad wife is short for traditional wife, and it refers to a woman who embraces traditional, we would say patriarchal gender roles within marriage and the family life. And this lifestyle often involves the women staying at home, managing the household, raising children, and supporting her husband as the primary breadwinner. The trad wife movement kind of idealizes the roles and values of the 1950s. We might also say the early 1900s, emphasizing homemaking, which they tend to, at least on the ones that are on YouTube and are maybe influencers, they tend to have some very involved work. They're making bread, which I have to say, I make bread, something I've done since I was very young. And I prefer that. I think it's healthier than other bread. So it's not just the making of bread, but it's making bread. It's making their own mozzarella. It's this and they're usually living on farms, right? So there's a lot of labor that's added because of how they live and where they live. And there's often a clear division of labor based on patriarchal gender norms. So I want to just talk about, and I was kind of taking notes when I was listening to this podcast episode for like the second or third time, because I wanted to talk about it because I think it relates to what I've been talking about in this podcast episode. And so Sarah Marshall, who is the host of You're Wrong About, was talking about, she says something to the effect of I feel like the concerns that I brought this topic to you with are basically, why are we so obsessed with hand making cereal at this point in time? And why has the trad wife risen? She says, I want to know if you think that this is correct, because my analysis based on what we've been talking about is that the past few years, and they had talked about this at the top of the show, in response to being a girl boss and the realization correctly that that is unfulfilling. She said, we now see this countervailing trend of the trad wife in maybe reaction to the girl boss. And she said, I would say to some extent, the rise of the trad wife is sincere and it's real. And to some extent, it's astroturfed conservative at a certain point propaganda. She said, it feels almost like a classic bait and switch where it's like, hey, come be a trad wife and you can wear pretty dresses and you can build fires in your wood stove and make mozzarella for your adoring children. And there's usually a lot of children, and live like a mom in a picture book and live in this world that never was. She says, in reality, it feels like the more freedom you surrender, the more worldly freedom you surrender, I don't think you get any more back at home. She says, these women are not the queen of the castle. Men are the king of the castle. And she says, I think I'm not going out on a limb here to say that having less freedom in the world, less access to money, less ability to be a wage earner, less ability to provide for yourself and your children. She says, I can't see an argument where that's better for you in the long run, or that that's going to work out on a large scale as a social movement. She says it's never really worked for women to trust the man they married to take care of them in the way that they deserve. Or for that fact, she says the men that they elect. She says it's never worked in the past, and I don't think it's going to work now. And then she kind of continues. She says, I was reassured that the law was settled, and it turns out it was not. Talking about women's bodily autonomy. And she says, I think that the key thing is that dropping out of public life. And she says, I think that can look like a lot of things. I think if, let's say, you're a content creator, which I'm a content creator. She is a content creator. She says, and your content is sort of you being a rural ballerina and making cheese and this and that and the other. If you're making a ton of money and you're savvy about that, and you are involved in political action and you know all sorts of other things, then as an individual choice, I can see where that could work. But I think in general, it's selling people a fantasy. It's like a pyramid scheme. It's like you're selling people what you have, but you only have it because you're selling it to other people. And she says, and like Sarah Archer had pointed out, it never really existed. This time that they're living in never really existed. And, Sarah Archer kind of pipes in and says, right, it's like people are selling a version of the 1900s where there's no TB, there's no cholera, we have antibiotics, we have the internet. She says the actual life that you would have led or that your ancestors led 100 years ago, 120 years ago, the privations and danger and medical horror of all of that is sanitized. And it just basically looks as though you're living in this kind of almost shaker sort of modernist present day. And she says, that was another lie about the past. The more you opt out of civic life, the less power you have. And even if you don't have money, if you're engaged in public discourse or taking part in things, that's power. And you can't give that up. However, being engaged in emotional labor, not leading to actual power. She says one of the truths, I think this goes back to Sarah Marshall. She says one of the truths they talk about is that some of the true riches that women have had historically and in the present and will in the future, and I think some of our greatest resources are the community that we share with each other and the ways that we're able to help each other and talk to each other. She continued, I think through friendships and through the people we know, we get a sense of how do we really feel? How do I feel? How do you feel? What do I need to confess how do you feel? What do I need? And to be honest, that my life may look great, but maybe I'm not happy. Or aesthetically, everything's pleasing, but I hurt inside. She says, if you're living on an island, metaphorically, where it's just the husband and kids and you, and you're in the mountains, there's no public schools and there's no teachers, there's no town square and there's no community. Essentially, it's like what Dolores Hayden was arguing, that the architecture and the lifestyle boxed women in so that they were alone with people who were depending on a certain kind of labor that they could perform. And she says, and I think if you're cut off from other parents at school or whatever that is, whatever that community looks like, you're more vulnerable and you have less power. She says maybe for mom influencers, they are creating their own access to power, but you have to keep expanding if you're in that mindset, which most Americans are. And you've also created a situation where it may seem like you have more access than most people to community. But she says, actually, I think you're in a water everywhere and not a drop to drink kind of situation. Because, yeah, you might actually have less. Because you have to perform your identity every day outwardly. And so the connections you make with the people, because what you do now is a performance that you have to do for your corporate allies or whoever you're working with. She says it becomes impossible to express the authentic self that you need in order to connect with other people. So there's a loss of community, whether it's because you're disappearing into the home or you're disappearing into this performance. And she says, to me, that's one of the things that feels most dangerous. And then Sarah Archer pipes in and makes this really interesting comment. So she says, I was recently researching a piece for a project she's doing about doomsday design. She says, like, designs for the end of the world, which has a very robust history because of the Cold War. She says, so in these doomsday designs, you're going to get a bag or stockpile the minute you leave the house. And let's say you're headed to Home Depot, you're actually on a very individualistic mission to get yourself supplies and tools. She says, like, you run out of food after a year, maybe, then what do you do? And she says, and essentially, the lesson of all of this is that the stuff is a red herring. She says, I mean, you do need certain supplies if there's a total calamity, but what you really need are friends and neighbors and skills. Because if something really terrible happens and agriculture falls apart, you have to start somewhere. You need to know who knows how to do what in your community. You need to know, who's a natural leader, who's good at planting, if you're talking a total apocalypse. And she says, I was so inspired by that to think that it's not about buying a thing. It's about investing in relationships. She continues, I think of the time that you spend with the people you love, or, not even the people you love. Because if we lived in a medieval village, we wouldn't love everyone, but there would be somebody we tolerated because we got along well whenever we had to see each other. Maybe this person has the good textiles. Maybe they're the person who makes beer or the person who knows how to shoe your horse. And she says, we're in too big of a national and international community for the kind of go along to get along philosophy to make sense on this scale that we're at. She says, but in terms of communities that we choose for ourselves, that we build for ourselves, we have to think about what resources can we acquire that won't become valueless tomorrow. And she says, and that's probably not the greatest tile in your kitchen. It's probably not the latest, greatest fridge. You can live happily with a fridge that's 10 years old. And then they kind of laugh and they say, and the fridge isn't going to save you. And then they quote by quoting Moira Donegan's piece that's in book form. And I want to end with that too. She says, Moira writes, quote, women still perform the majority of household chores, childcare, and elder care, the social maintenance that academics call kin-keeping, remembering their mother-in-law's birthdays, scheduling and the management of conflicts, resources, and outside help. Men today do slightly more of this than their fathers did. They do not do nearly as much as their wives do. Women's domestic labor is relied upon and enjoyed by everyone in their families, but always goes uncompensated and routinely goes unnoticed, end quote. And she says, Sarah Marshall says, I know the reason that women do more of this work than men. And she says there's many reasons. But I think part of it, especially based on the conversation we're having, is this very pervasive historical idea that women's work, women's interests are lesser than men's. Not because of what they are, but because women do them. Because of their adjacency to women. She says, because women are stupid and terrible, and so is everything we do. And for us to succeed at something a man does is insulting to him. And for a man to have to do something we succeed at is also insulting to him. She says, that's what I learned from growing up in the world as it's been to this point. And then she says, the point I would like to close on is that women don't do these things because they're the only jobs left to us or because we're inferior. We do it because we're going to survive and because we're building the structures that are keeping everyone's lives going, not just right now, but in the future. And in the apocalypse, it's not going to look like a road race through a desert. It's going to look like agriculture. So get your loom and your small neighborhoods. End quote. That was a great podcast episode. If you want to go listen to the whole thing, I would encourage you to do so. I think when it comes down to it, we have to recognize that the inability of men to understand emotional labor, to perform emotional labor, is harming them. And offloading that onto the women in their lives, whether that's their moms, their sisters, their wives, their daughters, that's not a sustainable format. And, I'm also going to do a podcast episode on, how young men today are really struggling. And this is part of that. This is a big part of that. Emotionally, they are feeling empty. And they're filling that emptiness with addiction, with anger, with rage, with violence. And I think that's a very sad trajectory. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.